I'd like to start by acknowledging my collaborators in alphabetical order: Alistair Adcroft, Scott Bachman, Fred Costruccio, Jessica Kenningson, Will Kleiber, Phil Pajon, and Zofia Stanley. I'd like to call out Zofia Stanley and Jessica Kenningson in particular. Zofia is a grad student who worked on this in the early stages, sort of the first half. Jessica Kenningson then picked up and worked more on the implementation. Gustavo Marquez and Alperal Tuntas provided crucial help to us for getting these simulations configured and running in the CESM environment at NCAR. Some background. Density in the ocean is a nonlinear function of temperature, salinity, and pressure. In a Boussinesq model, the pressure is hydrostatic. This relationship is called the equation of state. Most global ocean models are finite volume models, which means that the quantities that they track are averaged over grid cells, so cell averages of temperature, salinity, velocity, things like that. So in the model, if you need density, what you need is cell averaged density. We'll call that rho bar. That's not what the model computes, though. What the model does is it takes cell average temperature and salinity, T bar and S bar, and it just plugs those into the equation of state. Call that rho m. Rho bar is not equal to rho m. The difference is delta rho, and that's an error. McDougall and McIntosh, I think, were the first people to mention this error, and Jean-Michel Brocard was the first person to try to develop a parameterization to correct it. His parameterization was only implemented in the computation of the pressure gradient force. If the model's hydrostatic, then the buoyancy force, which depends on density, balances the pressure force, and then you use that to compute pressure, which then goes into the pressure gradient in the momentum equation. That was the only density computation that he corrected. When he ran it in NEMO, he saw changes in the position and strength of the Gulf Stream and its extension, the North Atlantic Current. And since it was a stochastic parameterization, it also increases the variability. Since then, it's been mainly used for ensemble simulations and data assimilation in NEMO. It's also been implemented in other models, including ROMs. Fred Costruccio at NCAR had a preliminary implementation in POP, and then Alistair Adcroft implemented Brocard's parameterization in MOM6, gave a talk about it at the AGU fall meeting in 2018. In early 2019, Fred, Alistair, and I decided to combine our forces and develop a new parameterization, not just to re-implement Brocard's, but to develop a new parameterization and then put it into MOM6. Our goals were to have a new parameterization that would be more accurate than Brocard's, more computationally efficient than Brocard's, and that would correct the density in more parts of the model. So we started with a bunch of offline work where we coarse-grained some high-resolution model output and estimated the error and then developed a parameterization that corrects the error. And Zofia Stanley actually gave a talk about this at the last Ocean Science meeting. And so I'm not going to go over that, but I will review quickly what the parameterization is. So you've got the model's density that it's already computing, and then you add to it this correction. So this is our deterministic parameterization, second derivative of the equation of state with respect to temperature, multiplied by effectively the gradient of resolved temperature squared, and then you multiply it by the grids, by the magnitude of the grid size. So it's essentially just a difference of temperature across grid cells, quantity squared. There is a tunable coefficient C. We estimate the value of that to be about 0.2 for a 1-degree model. We also developed a stochastic version, which just multiplies the deterministic one by e to the chi, where chi is Gaussian. So that's a log normal multiplicative correction. It is white noise in space, so there's no correlations in space, but it's not white noise in time. It has temporal correlations. And the temporal correlations vary in space. They actually depend on the resolved structure. So they vary from, say, 3 days to about 180 days, depending on the resolved kinetic energy. Compared to Brocard's parameterization, we do have a better fit to data via this coarse graining, and it is also cheaper. We only require one extra nonlinear function evaluation, this second derivative of the equation of state. And then if you want to use a stochastic version, Brocard's was only stochastic, but if you want to use a stochastic version for ours, there's only one scalar autoregressive process to simulate at every grid cell, whereas Brocard required multiple 3D AR1 processes per grid cell. So it's cheaper. We reported the parameterization's development and the offline diagnostic analysis in a paper that was published in James in 2020. And now we'll get into the results of what happens when you actually implement it and run it in a model. So we implemented it in the MOM6 ocean model in the computation of pressure gradient force like Broncar, also in the computation of the isopycnal slopes that's used in the GM and ready parameterizations, and then finally also within the density computation that happens inside the mixed layer eddy restratification parameterization. So we've implemented, we're pretty sure we're bug free, and we've actually run all of the simulations for all of these experiments, but we haven't completed analyzing the results from the tests where we've put this in the isopycnal slope and the mixed layer eddy restratification parameterization. So today I'm only going to report results where we implement this correction in the computation of the pressure gradient force. Our configuration, we're using the MOM6 ocean model in the NCAR CESM ocean environment, 2/3 degree resolution, workhorse resolution, Z-star vertical coordinate. It's a G case, so it's ocean and ice. It's forced by reanalysis winds, JRA 55. We have a single 58-year cycle. We did start that from a simulation that had already been spun up with 58 years of JRA 55. And then the results that I'll present today are averaged over the last 50 years of our 58-year simulations. In terms of cost, the deterministic parameterization adds about 1% to the cost, and the stochastic parameterization adds about 2%. So it is fairly cheap to turn this on. Before I get into the results, what would we expect? Well, first, expect the model to get worse. It's a low resolution model. There's lots of parameterizations. All of them have been sort of tuned to give something that's pretty good, but not perfect. And now we're adding something that's going to change the model. And we're not retuning anything. So it's not unlikely for the biases in some places to get worse and in other places to get better. What you could do is turn on this parameterization and then retune everything and see if you could make the bias better in the fully retuned model than it was in the original model. That's a very expensive exercise and a big exercise. So we're not doing that. What we're going to present here should be thought of in the sense of a sensitivity test. Just what happens when you turn this parameterization on? How does it change the model? And with that sensitivity information, you could then use it when you go to the bigger exercise of trying to retune the complete model with this parameterization in it. So with that out of the way, our correction, just where do we even expect it to do something? So this is our correction, and it's two pieces, gradient squared times second derivative. That second derivative is basically just a constant, which means that where this correction is going to be big versus small is almost entirely controlled by the magnitude of the resolved temperature gradient. If you see a big resolved temperature gradient, you're going to get a big change to the density. Furthermore, that second derivative is negative. So everywhere that we change the density, we make it lighter. We make it less dense uniformly. How do we expect that to change the solutions? Well, we're only changing the pressure gradient force. Anywhere that you have a geostrophic current, if you change the pressure force, you're going to change the current. So we do expect the way that the model will respond to this will be by changing its current structure. And then, of course, when you change the currents, everything else changes. All right, so that's expectations. What do we actually see? So what I'm showing here is the magnitude of the density correction at the surface averaged over 50 years on a log scale. Note that the density corrections are negative as they're supposed to be, and I'm showing the magnitude. So you see big changes along the path of the Gulf Stream, along the path of the Kuroshio, Oyashio. In the Southern Ocean, on sharp temperature fronts, you see some changes to density. You don't really see much along the equator. The Arctic is kind of cut off in this figure, but you don't really see anything there. You do see a little bit coming off of New Zealand. It's just been cut off in this projection. So that's where this thing is turning on. Now, what does it do? Here's just a global shot of changes in potential temperature and salinity averaged over 50 years at 400 meters depth. And it's the data with the parameterization turned on minus the control. The biggest change is that underneath the path of the Gulf Stream, you get cooling and freshening, whereas both north and south of that, in the subpolar and subtropical gyres, you get warming and salinification. There are other changes throughout the world ocean, in particular here in the South Atlantic and various other places. But for this talk, we're just going to focus on the North Atlantic. And in particular, we're going to focus just on the Lab Sea and Nordic Sea and the subpolar gyre here. So I'm showing averages across all winters for 50 years at the surface. Top row is potential temperature, bottom row is salinity, left is control, and then the center and right are differences, experiment minus control, for the deterministic and stochastic. They're deterministic and stochastic are really similar, so you just pick one column to look at. What happens is that in the winter, the Lab Sea on the surface gets both warmer and saltier. And then in the Nordic seas, north of Iceland, you get both cooler and fresher. Associated with those hydrographic changes, you also see changes in the mixed layer depth and in sea ice thickness, also in extent, but I'm only showing thickness. So in the Lab Sea, you get deeper mixed layers in winter and you get less sea ice thickness. And then in not Fram Strait, but Denmark Strait here, you get more sea ice thickness. Next, I'm going to talk about a mechanistic explanation for what is driving these changes, how these changes can be related back to the density correction. And to understand that, we need a little bit of hydrography and to understand the currents, in particular in Denmark Strait. So in Denmark Strait, you've got this blue current flowing down along the coast of Greenland, is called the East Greenland Current. It brings cold and fresh water from the Arctic down into the subpolar gyre and eventually into the Lab Sea. We've also got a current flowing northwards through Denmark Strait, the East Icelandic Erminger Current, and it's bringing relatively warm and salty water from the subpolar gyre into the Nordic seas. If you take a section across that strait and you look at velocity, here on the left is the control. You've got the East Greenland Current coming south on the left, and on the right, you've got the East Icelandic Erminger Current going north. When you turn on our parametrization, it changes the density, changes the pressure gradient. Through geostrophy, it changes the currents. And in this particular area, what it does to the currents is it slows both of them down. So the East Greenland Current gets weaker and the East Icelandic Erminger Current gets weaker. What I'm not showing here, this is averaged in summer. The relative strength of the correction is biggest in the summer. In the other seasons, in particular in the winter, you still see this change, but it's not as big relative to the current structure that's actually there. So because it's biggest in the summer, you see a bit of a dipole forming here near the surface in the summer. You see warmer, salty water on the south side, and you see colder, fresh water on the north side. And then as the seasons progress, that anomaly that formed in the summer gets transported with the current. So you have the warm, salty blob making it into the Lab Sea just in time for winter so that it can affect the mixed layer depth and sea ice thickness there. We do have other results that we dig into in a paper that's under review. And we do have other things that we're hoping to finish, but for the sake of time, I will stop there.